There are lives that teach us what it means to endure, not through words, but through the quiet defiance of never breaking. Clint Eastwood is such a life. You know his face, the squint that became legend, the silence that spoke louder than any speech. You've watched him stand alone in dusty streets as the man with no name. You've seen him as Dirty Harry, asking questions the law was too afraid to answer. But what you may not know is the man behind that steel gaze, the boy who learned hunger before he learned hope, the father who built empires but struggled to build a home. This is not a story about Hollywood. This is a story about survival carved from poverty, about love that slipped through calloused hands, and about the terrible price of never staying still long enough to be found. If you've ever felt the weight of choices you can't undo, if you've ever wondered whether success can heal what it costs to achieve it, then perhaps this story will speak to you. Because what happened to Clint Eastwood, what he endured, and what he lost along the way, may be one of the most haunting testaments to the American dream that our time has witnessed. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a boy who learned that nothing, not even home, was his to keep. May 31st. Etienne Jobai Sancher, San Francisco. The Great Depression had already torn across America like a wildfire, consuming jobs, homes, and futures. Into this chaos entered Clint Eastwood Jr., weighing 11 pounds at birth, so large the nurses nicknamed him Samson, as if size alone could protect him from what was coming. But strength for Clint was never a gift. It was a demand. His father, Clinton Sr., was a steel worker, proud hands, empty pockets. He watched factory gates close, one after another, each layoff tightening the noose around survival. His mother, Ruth Runner Eastwood, held the family together through sheer will. Love in their home wasn't spoken. It was endured, stretched thin through whispered arguments that echoed through walls too thin to hide anything. You could hear everything in those walls. Clint would later recall, especially the sounds that hurt. By the time he turned 10, Clint had lived in more than a dozen towns up and down the West Coast. Sacramento, Oakland, Redding. Every move meant starting over. New school, new strangers, new shame. Those weren't just addresses. He said years later, they were uprootings. Some nights when money ran out, the Eastwoods slept in their car, parked under flickering streetlights. Ruth wrapped baby Jean in her coat, while Clint pressed his back against the door, blocking the draft. The windows fogged with their breath. The cold bit through thin wool blankets. His stomach growled louder than the rain outside. But no one spoke of hunger. Silence was cheaper. Through the windshield, he'd watch the world blur by in wet streaks of yellow and gray, wondering if any of those glowing houses ever stayed in one place. Inside that silence, he learned to read his parents' fear like weather, his father's long stare at empty dinner plates, his mother's voice trembling beneath forced calm. Those were the storms of his childhood. They didn't fight much. He remembered, but sometimes the quiet was worse than shouting. He learned to make himself smaller, to breathe softly so the tension wouldn't notice him. And in that stillness, something fundamental was being forged. The blueprint of the man who would one day command silence on screen because he had first survived it at home. Control, endurance, and the unshakable belief that only what you build yourself cannot be taken away. School offered no refuge. Teachers called him restless, a polite word that hid the ache of never belonging. He was held back a grade, later expelled from Piedmont High for carving crude drawings into a desk, a small act of rebellion against the life that refused to stay still. It wasn't about trouble. He once said it was about wanting control somewhere, anywhere. That control came from an unlikely place. Music. At 12, he found a broken piano in a neighbor's garage and taught himself to play. He played until his fingers bled, the notes filling the air like something sacred. It was the first thing I ever owned that couldn't leave me. He said decades later, that battered piano became his first act of creation, proof that effort could build beauty, that discipline could tame chaos. That old piano, he said softly, was the only thing that made the cold feel smaller. By 15, Clint Eastwood had already learned truths most men spend a lifetime avoiding. That love can vanish, that security is borrowed, that silence is safer than pleading. His mother's steel, his father's quiet desperation. The endless moving, they became the bricks of a wall he would later build around himself. When asked years later how he created those stoic, steel-eyed characters, he only smiled. That wasn't acting. He said once, that was remembering. And maybe that's why, when life finally gave him choices, he chose to build instead of run. He bought land. He restored what others abandoned. He turned instability into permanence, scarcity into empire. I got tired of moving, he said in old age. So I started building things that would never move again. Because before he was a legend, before the lights and cameras and gold statues, there was just a boy in the back seat of a cold car, staring out at a world that had everything he didn't, whispering a promise to himself that one day nothing would ever be taken from him again. He grew up learning that nothing in life was his to keep. Not home, not safety, not even love. So when the ocean came for him at 21, Clint Eastwood met it the only way a man who had lost everything could, by refusing to let go again. That night of cold chaos and silence would carve his soul forever. It was 1951. He was just 21, a lean, untested soldier serving as a swimming instructor at Fort Ord, California. He wasn't chasing fame yet. Only a paycheck and some sense of direction. That weekend, he boarded a Navy aircraft bound for Seattle. A routine hop across the Pacific coastline. But routine can turn to catastrophe in the blink of an eye, somewhere over Point Reyes. The engine sputtered, the cabin shook, and before anyone could pray or panic, the plane plunged into the dark ocean below. Metal screamed, waves swallowed, and in an instant, Clint Eastwood, future icon, future millionaire, future legend, was nothing but a body in the freezing Pacific, clinging to life with empty hands and borrowed breath. There were no lights, no signal, no rescue in sight, only the merciless rhythm of the waves. The cold was not just biting, it was consuming. Each stroke felt like lifting lead through ice. He swam mile after mile through black water that could have been his grave. You can't think about distance. He would later say, you just think about the next breath. For over 2 miles, maybe 3, he fought the sea's invisible weight, salt burning his throat, muscles locking in agony, his heartbeat slowing under the cold. Somewhere between fear and instinct, something shifted. He wasn't just fighting to live. He was refusing to disappear. When at last he crawled onto the jagged shore, trembling, soaked, and half conscious, the world looked different. The stars above were no longer distant. They were witnesses. Every breath he took that night was borrowed time. Years later, Clint Eastwood would recall softly, "I realized how fast life could be taken away. I didn't want to waste a minute after that." That near-death night became the foundation of everything he would build. It taught him that survival was not noise, but focus. That time, not money, not fame, was the real currency of life. He carried that truth into every frame, every decision on film sets. He was known for speed and precision, wrapping movies days or even weeks early. Crews called it discipline. Friends called it obsession. That crash never left him. One longtime collaborator said he carried time like a weapon. Every acre he bought, every film he directed, every empire he built was rooted in that single night. The night he learned the difference between surviving and living. When others hesitated, Clint moved. When others dreamed, he built. He didn't hoard wealth for vanity. He built permanence to defy impermanence. The sea didn't just test him. It branded him. The boy who once floated helpless in the dark became a man who vowed never to drift again. Long before Clint Eastwood became the man whose glare could silence a room, he was just another shadow on a studio backlot, tall, quiet, and nearly invisible. Hollywood, in the early 1,950 seconds, was a city that devoured dreamers. Behind every shining marquee were 100 broken men, and Clint could have easily been one of them. He arrived with no training, no connections, and barely enough money to keep a room. Some nights, dinner was nothing more than stale coffee and half a sandwich from the day before. When he couldn't afford gas, he slept in his car. One blanket, one dream, and a silence so deep it could break a lesser man. I didn't have any connections. He once said, "Nobody gave me anything. I just stayed long enough for the others to quit." He took odd jobs, digging pools, stacking lumber, carrying props, anything to survive. Casting directors dismissed him again and again. Too stiff, too quiet, too serious. Hollywood wanted charm. Clint had gravity. While others talked their way into roles, he listened. He studied. He watched how light shaped faces, how pauses told more truth than dialogue. Patience, he later said, was my only currency. For nearly a decade, that was all he could spend. But that quiet endurance became his secret wealth, the kind of wealth that couldn't be stolen. Only built. His first real break came not with applause, but persistence. In 1959, he landed a role in Rawhide, a supporting part meant to fill space. Yet something about his stillness drew the eye. He didn't speak much, but when he did, every word felt earned. By the show's second season, audiences weren't watching the hero. They were waiting for the sidekick to speak. That silence, the same one that once cost him everything, now made him unforgettable. Within years, Clint Eastwood became television's new face of strength. Lean, silent, magnetic. For the first time, he wasn't surviving Hollywood. He was shaping it. Then came fate in the form of Italian director Sergio Leone. Clint nearly turned down a fistful of dollars because the script had so little dialogue. Why would anyone care about a cowboy who doesn't speak, he asked. But the silence felt like home, like memory. He took the part. The film was made on a shoestring budget, paying him only $15,000. But it earned over $20 million and changed cinema forever. with for a few dollars more and the good, the bad and the ugly. Clint Eastwood became a global icon. His face, half in shadow, half in sunlight, was no longer that of a struggling actor. It was the face of endurance itself. Yet even as the fame grew, so did the solitude. I've always felt like an outsider. He admitted, even when I was in the middle of everything. Hollywood's brightest star still carried the chill of that car seat, the echo of nights when success felt like a distant myth. He didn't chase the spotlight. He built it piece by piece out of the silence that had once defined him. That paradox, strength born from restraint, power born from pain, became the essence of every character he played. Dirty Harry wasn't fiction. The Man with No Name wasn't invention. They were reflections of the same boy who once whispered to himself in the dark, "Don't disappear," by the 1,970 seconds. Clint Eastwood had already climbed the impossible mountain. Fame, money, power. To most men, that would have been enough. But for him, it wasn't. Freedom, not fame, was what he'd been chasing all along. "I just didn't want someone telling me how to feel anymore," he once said softly, a line that carried the weight of years spent under other people's control. He had been molded, directed, and packaged by Hollywood's machine until he decided to build a machine of his own. That decision changed everything. With a few trusted friends and the savings from his television years, Clint founded Malpaso Productions, a company small in name but seismic in purpose. It wasn't born from ambition, but rebellion. "I was tired of asking permission," he once told a friend. Malpaso became the place where he could create without apology, fail without fear, and finally own what he made. His first project as director, Play Misty for Me in 1971, wasn't safe or commercial. It was haunting, intimate, the story of obsession and control, mirroring the very life he was trying to reclaim. Critics were divided. Clint didn't care. Approval was temporary. Ownership was forever. From that moment, he built not just films, he built foundations. His discipline became his wealth. While other directors drowned in ego and budgets, Clint worked like the blue-collar laborer he once was. Quiet, efficient, precise. "Time is expensive," he said, "and I don't intend to waste either." He filmed in weeks, not months, and every dollar he saved went back into his next project. By the time Unforgiven premiered in 1992, Clint had stripped the Western of its myth and left only its bones. Guilt, loss, redemption. The Academy crowned him with 2 Oscars. But the real victory wasn't gold. It was independence. That film grossed over $159 million worldwide, turning not only a profit, but a point. He didn't need Hollywood's permission to make masterpieces. Each movie that followed added bricks to the fortress he'd been quietly constructing all along. The Bridges of Madison County, $1 Million Baby, $216 million worldwide. Gran Torino, $270 million. He poured his earnings into permanent. The Mission Ranch Inn in Carmel by the sea, once a decaying relic, was lovingly restored under his own hands. The Tehama Golf Club, carved into the hills above Monterey, became both sanctuary and statement, a symbol of patience rewarded. His ranches stretched across Northern California. His homes stood firm in Bel Air, Sun Valley, and Idaho. Each property was an indulgence. It was insurance against ever being powerless again. "I moved my whole life." He said once, Now I build things that stay. What began as a boy's hunger for stability had turned into a man's empire of stillness. His net worth soared beyond 400 million. But his wealth wasn't measured in money. It was measured in mastery. Behind the camera, he ruled with calm precision. A nod, a pause, I think, a whisper. He didn't shout. He guided. Crew members once said, working with him felt like filming inside a heartbeat. Quiet, steady, deliberate. He never wasted words. One cinematographer recalled every look meant something. Perhaps it was because words had failed him too many times in his youth. Now his silence spoke with more authority than any voice in the room. Through that silence, he directed stories of wounded men, haunted souls, stubborn survivors, reflections of himself, reassembled in every frame. And when the lights fade and the reel stops spinning, Clint Eastwood's legacy will not just be counted in Oscars or box office records. It will be counted in what he built, in the acres he restored, the stories he owned, the lives he inspired. His empire was never made of noise. It was built from silence, from hunger, from grit, from the cold nights that once taught him how to survive. The boy who once scraped for change now owned horizons. Not out of greed, but gratitude. He didn't chase immortality. He built it brick by brick, film by film, dollar by dollar, until the man who once slept in his car could stand unshaken among the monuments he created and whisper with quiet triumph, "Nothing moves me anymore, because I finally built what stays," for a man admired by millions. Clint Eastwood's most haunting truth was never about fame. It was about love and how easily it slipped through his fingers. In 1953, at just 23, when his name meant nothing in Hollywood and his wallet was thinner than his hope, Clint met Maggie Johnson, a poised, intelligent woman who saw not the struggling actor he was, but the man he could become. They met on a blind date, a soft California night scented with promise. Two strangers sitting in a diner booth that would one day feel like a lifetime ago. Maggie laughed easily. Clint listened more than he spoke. She was steady. He said later, when I wasn't. In those early years, they had little more than faith in secondhand furniture. Their first apartment smelled of coffee and wet paint. They ate on folding chairs, sharing one blanket in winter. When Clint couldn't afford roses, he left her a piano note instead, a love song played on borrowed keys. Maggie believed in him when Hollywood didn't. She ironed his shirts before auditions, packed his lunch when he worked digging pools, cleaning airplanes, carrying lumber. Those same hands that would one day hold Oscars once scrubbed oil from steel just to keep the lights on. "We'll make it," Maggie whispered once. "Even if it takes a lifetime." For a while, that dream was enough. When Rawhide finally brought him fame in 1959, it should have been their shared victory. But success, like fame, comes wrapped in silence. The nights on set turned into weeks away. Clint's phone calls grew shorter, his voice more distant. Hollywood opened its arms, and Clint began to drift, not toward joy, but away from the stillness that had once grounded him. Fame doesn't change who you are. He said years later, it just shows what was already there. What it revealed was a man torn between the safety of home and the hunger of freedom. Maggie stayed loyal, patient, raising their two children, Kyle and Allison, in a home that grew quieter with every year. Kyle found his father's rhythm in jazz. Allison inherited his eye for truth and storytelling. But both grew up learning that in their house. Love was real, but presence was rare. Rumors didn't just follow Clint Eastwood. They became the quiet chorus beneath his fame, a sound he could never fully silence. Hollywood whispered his story long before he was ready to face it himself. Names floated through the air like unanswered prayers. Kimber, Scott, Catherine, Francesca, Morgan, Lori, each name a life tied to his, yet growing in another home, under another roof. Some bore his features, his eyes, even his silence, but not his name. Some he met later, others he only learned about through letters or chance encounters. It was a mosaic of families scattered by time, by secrecy, by the choices of a man who never stayed in one place long enough to see the cost of his leaving. Being known. Clint once said, doesn't mean being understood. Perhaps he wasn't speaking to the public. Perhaps he was speaking to them. Maggie never fought the tabloids or raised her voice. She faced the truth the way she faced everything. Quietly, with grace that hurt to witness, she smiled through the flashbulbs. The premieres, the long absences that became the rhythm of her days. There were nights she would hear the phone ring, pause halfway down the hall, and then let it stop, because she already knew it wasn't for her. In private, she carried her heartbreak not as a weapon, but as a habit. Friends recalled how she kept photographs of all the children, even those who weren't hers, tucked in a drawer, because, as she once told a friend, they're all his, and that's part of loving him. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was love that refused to harden. By the late 1,970 seconds, that love had worn thin, not shattered, just eroded. The distance between them wasn't silence anymore. It was geography. He was always away, on a set, in another city, in another story. She stayed, folding his shirts long after he'd stopped wearing them. Listening to jazz records Kyle loved. Reading Allison's scripts by the light of the kitchen lamp. In that house, there were echoes of a family that could have been whole. But fame, like the wind, had carried him too far. And though he had built homes across California, there was one home he never truly managed to build. The one where all his children could sit under the same roof. When they separated, there was no scandal, no shouting, only two people who understood that sometimes love can survive everything except time. Their marriage of 3 decades ended in 1984. The settlement, $25 million, was monumental, but the real loss was beyond price. Maggie kept the house. Clint kept the road. The children stayed with her. And Clint, ever the wanderer, built elsewhere. She never spoke ill of him. Not once. A family friend said that grace became her legacy. For Clint, the silence she left behind was deafening. In the years that followed, his art began to echo what his life had taken. The lonely men, the flawed fathers, the quiet souls who carried guilt like a second skin, they were all fragments of the same man. Tightrope, Unforgiven, $1 Million Baby. These weren't just films. They were confessions written in shadow and light. When asked what drove him to direct, he said simply, I wanted to understand. But what he was really chasing wasn't meaning. It was mercy. I was always moving forward. He admitted, but sometimes I wonder what I left behind. By then, he had built an empire. Land, films, legacy worth over $400 million. The Mission Ranch Inn, the Tehama Golf Club, homes from Bel Air to Carmel, all standing like monuments to permanence in a life once defined by motion. But even empires have empty rooms. In quiet moments, he would glance at old photographs. Maggie's laugh. Kyle as a boy. Allison asleep on his shoulder. Reminders of the home he once had and the man he forgot to be. And that's the cruel symmetry of his life. The same discipline that made him rich also kept him alone. He could rebuild ranches, restore hotels, and direct worlds into existence. But he could never rebuild the trust he lost. In Maggie, he didn't just lose a wife. He lost the last woman who loved him before the world did. And in that loss lies the truest lesson of Clint Eastwood's story. That success, no matter how vast, always charges a price. It's not counted in dollars or awards, but in the hearts you can't buy back, the laughter you'll never hear again, and the home you can't return to, no matter how many you build. If Maggie Johnson was the woman who steadied Clint Eastwood's climb, then Sandra Locke was the one who met him at the summit and watched him begin to fall. She wasn't a fleeting chapter in his legend. She was the flame that illuminated his genius and the wound that would never quite close. When they met in 1972 on the set of The Outlaw, Josie Wales, it wasn't simple attraction. It was two storm fronts colliding, electric, magnetic, and fated to both create and destroy. Clint was still married to Maggie, the woman who had carried him through obscurity, raising Kyle and Allison at home while he juggled the hidden weight of other lives. Kimber, Scott, Catherine, children born of paths that rarely intersected. Sandra, too, was married, but her union had long become ceremonial. When they crossed paths, it wasn't scandal. It was inevitability. For 14 years, they became Hollywood's paradox, the perfect couple on screen and the most fragile behind it. Films like The Gauntlet, Bronco Billy, and Sudden Impact pulsed with the energy of their real lives, two people fighting to hold on to love that burned hotter than it could sustain. To the public, they were glamour and gold. In private, they were two haunted souls tangled in the same need to be understood, to be needed, to not be alone. Sandra later confessed, "He was the love of my life," but also the most painful chapter of it. What began as devotion slowly tightened into dependence. Clint, shaped by a lifetime of control and silence, tried to protect her in the only way he knew, by directing, guiding, deciding. He financed her films, shaped her career, built her homes. To the world, it looked like generosity. To her, it began to feel like a cage. He was afraid to lose me. She once admitted, but even more afraid to let me be free. Their love became a mirror, reflecting the fears, regrets, and fragility that neither could escape. Then came the heartbreak that would echo for decades. 2 pregnancies ended before they became life. Choices made under pressures too great for words. For Sandra, they were not just losses. They were the quiet funerals of the family she had once dreamed of. For Clint, they were decisions born not of cruelty, but of chaos. A desperate attempt to keep control in a world that was slipping from his grasp. Between them grew a silence so heavy it began to erase them both. She wanted stability. He chased freedom. And the distance between those desires became an ocean no love could bridge. By the late 1980 seconds, Clint had quietly begun a new relationship with actress Frances Fisher. And soon, another daughter, Francesca, was born. When Sandra found out, it shattered her. It felt like dying with your eyes open. She told a confidant. The home that had once held laughter now echoed with ghosts. What followed wasn't vengeance. It was survival. She filed a lawsuit, not for money, but for acknowledgement. In her filings, she claimed that he had quietly limited her opportunities, closing doors that once welcomed her. Clint settled privately, as he always did, without spectacle, but no agreement could erase what was already carved into both of them. Love turned into loss, passion into silence, trust into memory. Years later, when asked if she still loved him, Sandra paused before whispering, "I kept waiting for him to say he was sorry." The apology never came. When Sandra Locke passed away in 2018, Clint Eastwood said nothing. No flowers, no public statement, just silence. The same silence that had both bound and broken them. But those who knew him well understood that silence wasn't indifference. It was grief. For a man who had built a career on control, this was the one story he could not direct, the one ending he could not rewrite. He had faced critics, studios, and the passage of time. But not this, not her absence. In the quiet of his Carmel ranch, he was seen more often alone, staring out over the ocean, where the light fades without noise. There are ghosts Clint lives with now. One longtime collaborator said softly, "Sandra is one of them." Her laughter still lingers in the halls he restored. Her favorite coffee blend still sits unopened on the counter. Every melody he touches on the piano carries her shadow. For all his wealth, the vast ranches, the sweeping golf courses, the fortune exceeding 400 million, none of it could fill the space she left behind. Because Sandra Locke was never just a chapter in his life. She was the reflection of his humanity, the reminder that love, once lost, can echo louder than applause. And in the silence that followed her passing, Clint Eastwood finally faced his most haunting truth, that the hardest part of loss is not absence. It's knowing you helped create it in the twilight of his extraordinary life. Just when it seemed that Clint Eastwood had finally escaped the long shadows of heartbreak and solitude, she appeared not as a star, not as a muse, but as a whisper of calm. Her name was Christina Sandera. They met quietly at his mission ranch in Carmel by the Sea, sometime in the early 2010 seconds, where she worked as a restaurant hostess. There was nothing cinematic about their beginning. No flash bulbs, no fanfare, just two people crossing paths amid the soft hum of everyday life. By 2014, she had moved into his home, and for the first time in decades, that house, long haunted by memories, absences, and echoes, felt lived in again. Christina was different from the others. She didn't want to fix him or follow him. She didn't need his fame or the power that came with it. What she offered was something he had spent a lifetime searching for. Stillness. Her affection was not grand, but constant. Her laughter was not loud, but healing. In her presence, the restless legend of Clint Eastwood seemed to exhale. With her, he once said softly, "I finally stopped chasing ghosts." For nearly a decade, Christina became the quiet rhythm of his days, cooking meals at sunset, sharing slow walks along the Carmel shore, sitting beside him as he played the piano he once thought he'd never touch again. She didn't remind him of what he had lost. She reminded him of what remained. And for a man who had always stood apart, Christina was the rare soul who stood with him, not for what he represented, but for who he was when the lights went out. But on July 18th, 2024, the quiet ended. Christina Sindera passed away at 61 from cardiac complications. Her heart, the very thing that had steadied his, giving out without warning. There were no headlines, no tributes on television, no Hollywood procession, just silence. The same silence Clint Eastwood had spent a lifetime both mastering and fearing. Through a family spokesperson came his only public words. Christina was a lovely, caring woman, and I will miss her very much. For a man who had lived through plane crashes, scandals, and losses too many to count, this one was different. This one left him still. Neighbors noticed the change. The blinds stayed drawn, the piano untouched, the garden untended. A man once known for his command of time now seemed suspended in it. At Christina's private service, held in a small chapel not far from the ocean, Clint stood apart, dressed in black, frail yet unbowed, eyes fixed not on the past, but on the space where she used to be. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. As the final prayer ended, he lingered alone, his weathered hand resting on her urn just a moment longer than the rest. Those nearby said he whispered something, but no one heard what it was. Later, when the housekeeper returned to his home, she found Christina's favorite scarf folded neatly on his chair, her glasses still by the window. Nothing had been moved. Nothing would be. Christina had never sought the spotlight. She was never called wife, never posed beside him on a red carpet. But to Clint, she had been his quiet redemption, the proof that love, even late in life, could still arrive without judgment or demand. In her, he found peace. In losing her, he lost that peace again. Her passing wasn't just the end of companionship. It was the end of sanctuary, the soft, steady harbor that had finally let him feel at home. And now, in the house that overlooks the same Pacific he once fought to survive, Clint Eastwood lives surrounded by silence once more. Not the strong silence of youth, but the fragile silence of absence, the kind that lingers where love used to live. When asked how he's doing, he answers the way only Clint Eastwood could. Now it's quiet again, but those who have heard him say it know that quiet is not peace. It's memory, echoing softly through the walls of a legend who, after a lifetime of building empires, has learned that the one thing even time cannot rebuild is the sound of someone's laughter when it's gone. Over the decades, Clint Eastwood built his cinematic kingdom, playing men of principle, lone riders who defended the helpless, who stood firm against chaos, who stared down death with steady eyes. Yet beyond the silver screen, in the quiet hallways of his private life, the greatest role he ever faced wasn't scripted, rehearsed, or directed. It was fatherhood, a role he spent a lifetime trying and often failing to understand. In his world, silence was affection. Distance was control. He has long been known to have fathered 8 children with 6 women. Yet for decades, he refused to speak of numbers, as if love could not be measured in headlines. Some children didn't know his face until adulthood. Others grew up under his shadow, but never quite in his arms, separated not by oceans, but by choices, by time, by the echo of a man who kept moving before anyone could reach him. Among them was Lori Murray, born in the 1950 seconds and adopted soon after. She grew up unaware of her lineage, her life unfolding far from Hollywood's glare. Decades later, when she discovered the truth that Clint Eastwood was her biological father. She did not react with anger, only quiet awe. It was as if a ghost had walked back into his own story. A family friend recalled, not to demand answers, but to belong. Then came Kimber, born in 1964 from his relationship with Roxanne Tunis while he was still married to Maggie Johnson, the woman who had once steadied his climb when everything else was uncertain. Maggie would later give him 2 children of her own. Kyle, born in 1968, who found his father's rhythm in jazz. And Allison, born in 1972, who inherited his eye for direction and storytelling. Yet even as the family tree expanded, the branches rarely touched. Years later came Scott Eastwood, born in 1986 to Jacelyn Reeves, a son whose jawline and steely gaze mirrored his father so hauntingly that fans called him Eastwood Reborn. But as Scott once said with quiet honesty, he didn't make it easy. He made you earn it. Those words weren't bitter. They were tender, layered with understanding. Catherine, Francesca, and Morgan followed, each from different mothers, each another heartbeat in a life lived in chapters, not continuity to the public. Clint Eastwood was a fortress, wise, unshaken, almost mythic, but to his children, he was something less defined and more human. A man who could build worlds on screen, but struggled to build warmth at home. Birthdays passed without calls. Letters stayed unsent. Time drifted. He wasn't cruel. One longtime acquaintance said softly, just somewhere else, always somewhere else. In interviews, he spoke of his children sparingly, as if afraid to hold their names too tightly in case they slipped away again. The man who had made audiences weep as fathers on film, protective, wounded, self-sacrificing, often couldn't translate that tenderness into real life. Perhaps it wasn't absence of love, but an absence of language. Some hearts broken too early. Never learned the words for closeness, now in the quiet winter of his years. Clint Eastwood lives surrounded not by applause, but by the soft company of his grown children. They visit when they can, gatherings that are small, unannounced, yet full of quiet meaning. A photo emerges here and there. Clint standing beside Scott at a premiere, a faint smile shared with Allison at a charity event, Kyle performing one of his jazz compositions in his father's honor. Behind those captured moments lies something heavier than nostalgia, an unspoken reconciliation, fragile but real. Those close to him say he has grown gentler, slower to judge, quicker to listen. At dinners, he watches faces that mirror his own, strong lines, steady eyes, and perhaps wonders how much of himself they inherited and how much he still owes them. None of his children speak with resentment. Their words, complicated, private, independent, paint a portrait not of anger, but of quiet acceptance. Clint Eastwood once said, "You can only be young once, but you can be immature forever." It was meant as a joke, but behind it lies the confession of a man who spent decades learning how to show up only after the moment had passed. He gave the world timeless heroes, but to those who bore his name, it was his absence that spoke the loudest. There were no grand reconciliations, no sweeping apologies, just gestures, a dinner invitation, a quiet hug, a nod across a crowded room. For a man who built empires from story and silence, fatherhood became his most honest script, unfinished, flawed, but true. And perhaps that is where his redemption lies. Because in the end, even legends must face the most human reckoning of all. That love, once missed, can still be mended, not through words, but through presence. And maybe that is the legacy Clint Eastwood will leave behind, not just a fortune of land, films, and fame, but the hard-earned grace of a father still learning how to be one in the twilight of a life that has already outlasted myth. Clint Eastwood lives not in the noise of fame, but in the hush of endurance. More than 9 decades have passed since that restless boy of the Great Depression swam through the wreckage of a downed plane and the storms of rejection to build one of the most unshakable legacies in Hollywood. Today, what he owns is not measured in gold or applause, but in something rarer: permanence. His fortune, valued around $400 million, is the quiet result of nearly 70 years of relentless work, discipline, and restraint. Every film he directed, every acre he purchased, every home he restored tells a single story of a man who built stability out of uncertainty. Among his proudest creations stands the Mission Ranch Inn in Carmel by the Sea, a property he first saved from demolition in the 1,980 seconds. What was once an abandoned relic is now a 22-acre estate of whitewashed cottages, a piano bar, and panoramic views of grazing sheep and the Pacific beyond, a living memory of the America he grew up believing in. He still walks its trails at dawn, where ocean mist and memory meet higher in the hills. The gates of his Tehama Golf Club open onto 2,000 acres of rolling wilderness. His private sanctuary in Monterey County. There, modern architecture meets nature's raw edges, and the man who once lived paycheck to paycheck now owns a world measured in sky and silence. His other homes are scattered like chapters of a long life. A Bel Air mansion purchased in the 1,990 seconds. Minimalist and timeless, where he occasionally hosts family gatherings, a Sun Valley retreat in Idaho. Surrounded by snow-dusted pines, where he escapes Hollywood altogether, and the Rising River Ranch. His sprawling Northern California property that once hosted family barbecues and quiet fishing trips. He also owns a discreet oceanfront home in Maui, where the air smells of salt and pine, and where, as neighbors recall, he reads screenplays on the porch with coffee at sunrise. Each property understated, sturdy, unchanging, reflects the man who built them, grounded, enduring, indifferent to flash. Though his collection is modest compared to many of his peers, it carries his character. A fleet of classic cars that speak more of craftsmanship than luxury, a Gran Torino restored by his own hands, a vintage Lincoln, and a Porsche 911. He drives through Carmel's winding roads with the same deliberate calm he brings to his films. He has no private jet, preferring chartered flights, no super yacht, though he occasionally sails off the California coast with old friends. His indulgence has never been excess, but longevity, choosing what lasts over what shines. For Clint Eastwood, wealth was never about collecting things. It was about reclaiming control. From the boy who once moved from town to town chasing his father's work, to the man who now owns thousands of acres of California soil. Every purchase carries a quiet defiance, proof that the ground beneath his feet will never again be taken from him. I never liked waste, he said once, but I like things that last. And so his fortune stands not as a monument to greed, but as an archive of endurance. the material evidence of a life that refused to collapse. But behind every legacy lies complexity, and his is written across generations. Clint Eastwood is the father of 8 children, each with their own lives, talents, and memories of him. Kyle, his eldest son with Maggie Johnson, is now a celebrated jazz musician, soft-spoken and thoughtful, the quiet rhythm to his father's storm. Allison, born in 1972, followed him into the film world, an actress, director, and voice of compassion. Kimber, from his long relationship with Roxanne Tunis, built her own path as a producer and makeup artist, living far from headlines. Then came Scott, son of flight attendant Jacelyn Reeves, now one of Hollywood's rising stars. With his father's steel gaze and discipline, Scott often says, "Dad taught me that nothing worthwhile comes easy." Beside him is his sister Catherine, a writer and actress, Francesca, born to actress Frances Fisher, now a model and filmmaker, Morgan, the youngest daughter of his marriage to journalist Dina Ruiz, who carries the grace of her mother and the spirit of her father. And then there is Laurie Murray, the daughter given up for adoption in the 1950 seconds, who reconnected with Clint decades later. Their reunion was private, free of spectacle, marked not by tears, but by quiet recognition. It wasn't about making up for lost years. One friend described it simply, it was about peace. Together, these 8 names form not a perfect family portrait, but a mosaic, beautiful, uneven, deeply human. They have different mothers, different histories, yet all share fragments of the same man, his quiet, his grit, his need to build. Some remain close, others keep distance. None speak with resentment. He's complicated. One child once said, "But he's ours." Time has softened what fame once fractured. In recent years, family gatherings have become smaller, simpler. Dinners at Carmel, birthdays marked not by grandeur, but by presence. For a man who spent his youth running, staying still has become its own form of redemption. Though Eastwood's fortune could fill museums, it is the unseen investments that define him now. He has given millions to environmental conservation, veterans, charities, and arts education. Often anonymously, if you have more than you need, he once told a friend, "You should leave the world better than you found it." There is no publicized foundation, no grand gestures, only quiet giving. As for inheritance, Clint has reportedly placed his assets in trusts designed to preserve family harmony. A reflection of a man who has lived long enough to understand that money divides faster than it unites. His truest legacy, he often says, is not what he built, but what endures. And yet, even surrounded by beauty and comfort, solitude lingers. The Mission Ranch piano still stands in the same corner where he once composed in the dark. The view from his Carmel home stretches endlessly toward the sea, a sea he once swam for his life, a sea that never forgot him. Neighbors describe him now as quiet, gracious, always walking at dawn. No entourage, no spectacle, just a man who, after a lifetime of motion, seems finally at rest. Those who visit say he still watches the sun sink over the Pacific in silence, as if measuring what remains: time, memory, gratitude. Clint Eastwood has spent his entire life defining strength for others, yet his truest strength may be the way he has learned to accept fragility. He has lost lovers, friends, and years he can't reclaim. He has seen his name turned into myth and his image into symbol. But beneath it all remains the same boy who once whispered to himself in the back seat of a cold car that he would never be forgotten. And he never was. He built an empire not of gold, but of endurance. An empire of will, silence, and the simple faith that persistence itself is a kind of immortality. So when you look at Clint Eastwood now, the weathered face, the steady eyes, the quiet beneath the legend, remember this. His story isn't just about cinema or fortune. It's about the price of greatness, the weight of time, and the grace of still being here. If his life or his films have ever moved you, carry that with you. Because even legends, especially the quiet ones, need to know that their echoes still matter.